Hello, good evening. My name is Mark Berg. I'm an associate professor, I'm reading here, I'm sorry, of sociology and criminology here at the University of Iowa. I also serve as the director of the Crime and Justice Policy Program at the Public Policy Center. I'd like to thank you all for joining us tonight for this important discussion. We will begin tonight's symposium with brief presentations by each of our panelists, each of which are approximately 15 minutes long and will focus on a specific topic concerning the nation's gun violence burden. Their presentations will be followed by a question and answer session moderated by Ben Kiefer of Iowa Public Radio. You, the members of the audience, are encouraged to submit questions to our panelists on the small note cards that are available in the back of the room near the water dispensers, just near the doors. Two of my colleagues will be collecting the note cards from you during the panel session of tonight's program. Please wave your card and they'll come by and retrieve that from you. They ask that you please write legibly, perhaps in block format, so they're able to read the cards. Anyone interested in applying for continuing education credits, cards are available near the entrance with the URL for the appropriate form. Now allow me to introduce our panel of distinguished speakers. I'll begin in the order which they will present. I'll begin with Richard Rosenfeld. Richard Rosenfeld is a Founders Professor of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. His research focuses on crime trends and crime control policy. Professor Rosenfeld is a fellow and a former president of the American Society of Criminology. In 2017, he received the American Society of Criminology's Edwin H. Sutherland Award for career contributions to criminology. He has written or co-edited several books, including Crime in the Economy and Crime in the American Dream. He chaired the National Academy of Sciences Roundtable on Understanding Crime Trends. Professor Rosenfeld recently served as a member of the Science Advisory Board in the Office of Justice Programs within the U.S. Department of Justice, where he served as a chair of the Committee on Data Collection and Statistics. Next, immediately to Rick's left, is Janet Lauritsen. Janet is a Curators Distinguished Professor of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. Her research focuses on the causes and consequences of victimization, the social and historical context of crime and victimization, and quantitative research methodologies. She is among the nation's foremost experts on the National Crime Victimization Survey, one of the nation's leading crime indicator data tools. Dr. Lauritsen recently served as a chair of the panel on modernizing the nation's crime statistics for the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. She is co-editor of the journal Criminology, the discipline's flagship journal, and a fellow of the American Society of Criminology. Next, to Janet's immediate left, I'd like to introduce you to Philip Cook. Phil is a Terry Sanford Professor Emeritus of Public Policy, Economics, and Sociology at Duke University. Much of his research is focused on understanding how and why to separate guns from violence through effective regulation and law enforcement. He is currently working with the University of Chicago Crime Lab, where he is scientific director of a project to increase clearance rates in gun assaults and murders. Professor Cook is author or co-author of books on alcohol control, state lotteries, income inequality, and the economic cost of gun violence. He has served as a consultant with the U.S. Department of Justice Criminal Division and the U.S. Department of Treasury Enforcement. Professor Cook is an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine and a fellow of the American Society of Criminology. Immediately to Dr. Cook's left, I'd also like to introduce you to Thomas Abt. Thomas is a senior research fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Both in the United States and globally, he writes, teaches, and studies the use of evidence-based informed approaches to reduce urban violence, among other criminal justice topics. His book, Bleeding Out: The Devastating Consequences of Urban Violence and a Bold New Plan for Peace in the Streets, was published in June of 2019. His work is frequently featured in major media outlets such as The Atlantic, The Economist, Foreign Affairs, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and National Public Radio. Before joining Harvard, Professor Abt served as Deputy Secretary for Public Safety to Governor Andrew Cuomo in New York, where he oversaw the state's criminal justice and homeland security agencies. During his tenure, he led the development of New York's GIVE. GIVE is Gun-Involved Violence Elimination Initiative, which employs evidence-based, informed, data-driven approaches to reduce gun violence. Professor Abt also served as Chief of Staff to the U.S. Office of Justice Programs at the U.S. Department of Justice, where he worked with the nation's principal criminal justice grant-making and research agencies to integrate policy and practice. He also played a lead role in establishing the National Forum on Youth Violence Prevention, a network of federal agencies and local communities working together to reduce youth and gang violence. Also allow me to introduce to you again Ben Kiefer from Iowa Public Radio. Ben is here. He will serve as a moderator for the question and answer series of tonight's event. Ben joined Iowa Public Radio in 2000 and is host of Iowa Public Radio's daily noon talk show, River to River, which he also helps produce. Since 2001, he has hosted and produced Iowa Public Radio's weekly live music program, Java Blend. Ben holds an adjunct faculty position at the University of Iowa in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication. Please, everyone, join me in giving our panelists a warm welcome to the University of Iowa.
Good evening. I want to thank Mark and everyone else who had any role in putting this panel together. I'm very happy to be here. I'd love to chat, but we're on the clock, so I'm going to get right to it. My job, the first two presentations you'll hear, are about trends in gun violence, both lethal and non-lethal. I'm going to talk about gun violence nationwide. I'm going to talk about gun violence and overall homicide rates in Iowa over essentially the last 40 years. I'll talk about these victimization rates by race. I'll talk about non-fatal firearm victimization rates by race. I'll say a word or two about so-called mass killings. And I'll compare the United States gun homicide level with that in other nations. And I'm going to do all that in the next 14 minutes. Just very briefly, the trends that you'll see are based on the U.S. Vital Statistics System, the National Crime Victimization Survey, which you've already heard a word about, Mother Jones Magazine, I'll explain that connection when we get there, and a recent study of gun violence rates in the U.S. and other nations. Okay, let's get on to the trends then. What we have here are the trends in gun violence in the United States. This is gun homicide, I should say, per 100,000 population. So these are rates. There's the U.S. total. That's gun plus non-gun. There's the U.S. firearm. Oh, not quite there yet. There's the firearm rate. Below that is the Iowa total in blue, dash line, and then below that is the Iowa firearm rate. So what the takeaway here, I think there are two, perhaps three. One is that gun violence rates, as you'll see in a moment, in the United States are quite high. But they have not been going up. They've been coming down over the last few decades. There's been about a 40% drop in total homicide rates and gun homicide rates in the U.S. since the early 1990s. In Iowa, the overall rates are lower, as you can see, and they've been relatively flat with fits and starts over the last 40 years or so, until we get to, maybe the last 10 years. And then they've been coming up in Iowa. And the increase in Iowa preceded the increase. There is an increase. You can see it if I get the pointer there. You can see it in the overall homicide rate, and in the gun homicide rate. In Iowa, you see the same increases, but they start a little earlier. And even though the rates are lower, those increases are relatively substantial. There's been about a 50% increase in the total homicide rate in Iowa since, roughly speaking, perhaps 2008 or 9. Now, how many homicides are we talking about in Iowa? Fortunately for Iowans, not as many as one sees many other places. In 2017, there were 104 homicides, criminal homicides in the state of Iowa. 64 of those, roughly 60%, were gun homicides. That's a relatively low rate of gun homicide, comparing Iowa to other U.S. states. And that 104 homicides is roughly double the number of homicides that Iowa was experiencing up to about 2008, 2009. Okay. With that as background, here are homicide victimization rates, homicide victims per 100,000 population in the United States by race. And roughly speaking, we see the same pattern we saw earlier, with an increase from the mid-'80s up to a peak in the early '90s, a precipitous drop during the '90s, and then a flattening until 2015 and 2016, where we see a notable increase, and then another flattening. It turns out that while the victimization rates for whites are quite a bit lower, and I've got the Iowa figures for 2017 right up here. It's useful to put that white rate right on top of the black rate. And the way I did that was simply scaled the white rate on the right-hand vertical scale, and the black rate is scaled on the left-hand vertical scale. So the victimization rates for blacks many times higher than those for whites. But given that, it's rather remarkable, I think, the correspondence between both the increase and the decline and the more recent flattening out in black and white victimization rates. That implies that the same or many of the same conditions are driving both of those rates, despite the very different levels. That's the fatality story, or that's a small part of it. Let me talk a bit, though, about non-fatal firearm victimization rates. This is per 1,000 population age 12 and over a somewhat shorter period from the early 90s through 2018. So now we're looking at firearm, non-fatal firearm victimization rates for the crimes of aggravated assault, robbery, and rape and sexual assault. And I've got the total rate, which is in the darkened black line, and the white rate in yellow, and the black rate in blue. And we see from the early 90s to the present, the patterns we saw earlier now replicated, roughly speaking, in non-fatal firearm victimization rates. A large drop in the black non-fatal victimization rate over this period. That's about a 75 to 80% drop since the early 1990s. There's been about a 60 to 65% drop in the white non-fatal victimization rates as well. Now, one wants those rates to go down even further, but the story here is, despite the difference in levels, both have been trending down over time. Mass killings. They're in the news. These are defined generally as killings in a single incident of 4 or more persons. Mother Jones, interestingly enough, has compiled a decent, reliable database on mass killings, but the Mother Jones database does not include in it incidents in which 4 or more persons are killed if those incidents were domestic homicides that occurred in a non-public setting, typically a home. It does not include gang-related homicide, nor does it include drug-related homicides in incidents with 4 or more victims. Why? Because Mother Jones wants to focus on those mass killings that have made the news. Over the period 1982 to 2019, Mother Jones counted 941. That's a lot of mass killings, and it excludes at least the same number, even a little more, 4 or more victim incidents of the type I mentioned earlier. Mass killing, during that same period, there have been just under 500,000, and that slide should read gun homicides, firearm homicides. Just under 500,000 since 1982. So mass killings are clearly a problem. They constitute a very small fraction, about 0.3% of total gun homicides. Nearly all mass killings are with a firearm, of total gun homicides in the United States. I don't think that diminishes the problem, but it does put it, I think, in useful perspective. Finally, where does the United States stand in relation to much of the rest of the world? And these are nations, by and large, with which we usually compare ourselves. Most of them are medium to high income nations like ours. In firearm homicides, these are firearm homicide rates for the year 2010 for 23 nations. Just over 3.5 per 100,000 is the rate in the US, and that's 7 times higher than the rate in Canada and Portugal, and many times more than that, than the rates in the countries you see, primarily European countries, but also New Zealand, and as we go down the list, Japan and Norway, and I can't even read it from here, United Kingdom at the bottom. Why are there no bars attached to those countries? That's not because there was no data. That's because there were so few of those incidents that they don't show up on the chart. All right? So there's your introduction to trends, and you'll have more of that in just a moment.
Thank you. So I've been asked today to talk about some of the research on gender and firearm violence, and to briefly summarize some of the policies that have the potential to reduce such gender-based violence. So to do so, I'm going to begin with a brief overview of the trends in non-lethal and lethal firearm victimization that is experienced by males and females in the U.S. I'll then discuss some of the key findings from what I believe is one of the better and more useful studies of the impact of state laws that were developed with the intention of reducing intimate partner homicide. So in this first slide, I have here the extent of non-lethal firearm victimization experienced by males and females over the past 25 years. Non-lethal gun trends are important to examine because those incidents represent the ongoing degree to which persons are exposed to a potential injury and death due to firearms. And these trends show how, of course, how risk has changed over time. I'll say a little bit about the NCVS, the National Crime Victimization Survey. It's an ongoing data collection effort sponsored by the Bureau of Justice Statistics. They keep a public tool up on their website where you can take a look at a couple of factors at the same time in the trends. And there are several advantages to using these data. One of the most important features is that it contains crimes that are both reported and not reported to the police. And the data contain a wealth of information about the incidents, such as the characteristics of the victims and the offenders, as reported by the victims themselves, and these data that are not available elsewhere. However, because it's a survey of victims, of course, it can't be used to study homicide, and child victimization and experiences of prisoners and other persons living in institutions are excluded as well. So here you can see that as a similar story, what we heard just a moment ago, that non-lethal gun victimization was at its highest levels in the 1990s, when there were approximately 1 million of these incidents per year against males and about 500,000 per year against females per year. The risks for gun violence declined notably then during the 90s for both groups, and over the last 10 years has remained fairly stable with some signs of a small and recent increase. The rates for 2016 to 2018 are about 2.1 for males, which represents an average of about 280,000 incidents per year, and about 1.3 per thousand females for an average of about 190,000 non-lethal gun victimizations per year. So roughly speaking then, the male risk for non-lethal gun victimization is about 60% higher than that of females. Now, victims of gun violence, non-lethal gun violence, tell us that they reported about 63% of these incidents to the police in the recent years. And in addition, the victim-offender relationship information in these incidents is reported by the victims. Male victims report that about 75% of the incidents that they experience are committed by strangers, 3% by intimate partners, and about 23% by other persons known to them. Female victims tell us that about 49% were committed by strangers, 18% were committed by intimate partners, and 23% by others known to them. I don't think that information is really well known, because most of what we know about victim-offender relationships and violence is after there's been a death and an investigation. So we've just seen that there was a recent and notable increase in the previous slides that Professor Rosenfeld presented in the gun homicide rate. And in this next slide, I have separate trends for male and female gun homicides through 2017. That's the most recent year of available data. And as was the case for the non-lethal gun victimization, there was a significant decline in firearm homicide for both males and females during the 90s. However, here we see that in the most recent years, there's been a considerable increase in death due to gun homicides in both groups. For males, the rates increased 28% from 2014 to 17, and for females, they rose by 32%. Because gun homicides increased more rapidly than the rate of non-lethal gun victimizations, these two sets of data trends, gun homicide and gun non-lethal violence, taken together, suggest that the homicide rise was not simply due to overall increases in gun violent incidents, but perhaps due in part to an increase in lethality. The lethal capacity of guns has grown over time in the form of higher caliber bullets and larger magazine capacities, and therefore when such guns are used, their outcome can be expected to be more lethal than when guns were used in the past. Therefore, it doesn't appear to be the case that the recent homicide rise resulted from increases in the number of potentially lethal incidents, but perhaps from greater firearm lethality. Generally speaking, here the male rates are about 5 to 6 times more likely, 6 times higher than those of females. And the lethality ratio, which is the proportion of all gun violent incidents that result in a death, is higher for men than it is for women. It's difficult to determine precisely how much of this recent increase in female and male gun homicide is due to the actions of strangers, intimate partners, or other persons known to the victim. And this is because the offender is unknown in a very substantial proportion of homicides. For example, when males are killed, about 57% of the offenders are unknown, at least at the time the data is recorded and made available. And when females are killed, 35% of the offenders are unknown. Statisticians have techniques for providing estimates of the likelihood or the likely relationship between the victim and offender, and based on these estimates, it's the best we can do. It's been suggested almost half of the women killed are killed by intimate partners, compared to about 5% of the male victims. When men are killed, about 30% are estimated to be at the hands of strangers, and just over half are estimated to be killed by other non-family persons known to them. So for both males and females then, non-strangers are responsible for more deaths than are strangers. But because of such a large proportion of female homicide victims are killed by intimate or former intimate partners, much of the policy-related focus on female homicide emphasizes legislation that's been designed to reduce women's risk of intimate partner homicide. And because most women killed by intimate partners, in recent years especially, are killed by a gun, roughly 60%, It's prompted a variety of legislative efforts designed to make it illegal for those convicted of an intimate partner felony or misdemeanor to possess a firearm. Although federal laws have prohibited firearm possession by such persons since the passage of the Violence Against Women Act in 1994, there has been limited federal enforcement of these laws. Many states, on the other hand, have enacted their own intimate partner violence-related possession prohibition laws. However, some of these laws do not explicitly require the surrendering or relinquishing of owned weapons. Some states do order the surrendering of weapons to law enforcement or licensed gun dealers within 24-hour period following a conviction for a felony or IP felony or misdemeanor. And some states also include firearm surrender following the issuance of an IPV restraining order. And I say IPV, I mean intimate partner violence, restraining order, usually, of course, obtained by women when they believe their lives are in serious danger. Some states also require the removal of firearms by police from the scene of intimate partner violence incidents as well. So the important policy question then is whether these differing laws have an impact on the intimate partner homicide rates, and if so, which are most effective. So this next slide summarizes the results from a recent and, in my view, one of the more convincing and most rigorous analyses of the impact of these different state laws on the intimate partner homicide rates. This study appeared in a 2017 article published in the Annals of Internal Medicine, and the authors studied the effects of these varying laws on intimate partner homicide and on intimate partner gun homicide across the 50 states for the period 1991 to 2015. They took into account a wide variety of factors that are known to be related to homicide rates, such as education levels, unemployment and poverty rates, levels of income inequality, and the percent living in an urban area. They also controlled for incarceration rates, the number of police per capita, and for rates of alcohol consumption and self-reported depression. Finally, they controlled for other forms of violent crimes, all of this in an effort to help ensure that the effects that they found were due to the specific firearm laws and not to some other factor that may influence homicide. So what the study showed is that the various types of laws that are listed here, tried to summarize them, are all associated with lower rates of firearm intimate partner homicide. However, only one combination of laws had a large enough impact to be able to state that it was statistically significant. States that enacted laws that prohibited the possession of a firearm if the partner was subject to an intimate partner violence-related restraining order and required the surrendering of a gun was associated with a 15% lower firearm intimate partner homicide rate. Gun intimate partner homicide. When states had a similar prohibition law but didn't have the relinquishment requirements, their rates were about 6% lower, but that impact was not large enough to be statistically significant. Other laws were also associated with the lower levels, but their effects were very small, taken together, and not statistically significant as well. So what the authors also displayed in their paper, and there's a citation for that at the bottom if you want to read more about it, has very useful appendices about different laws in different states in this area. What they also displayed, and I've captured it here, are the trends in intimate partner homicide among the states with and without the intimate partner violence restraining order firearm surrender laws. The top line, that's kind of a faded dotted line, are the states without restraining order firearm relinquishing laws, and the thicker line is those states with those laws. And they've also marked the states that do have such laws underneath the trends there, and according to the year in which those laws were enacted. What you can see in this slide is that there's been some decline in intimate partner homicide, and also, though in the states without such laws, a slight increase from 13 to 15. Now this study was published and used data that did not include the years 2016 and 17 when we really saw the run-up in female and male homicide. The states that did have the laws showed a decline in 2014 and no increase in 2015 in intimate partner gun homicide. So given the large increase that we saw earlier in the 16-17 rates, it would be important to update this analysis to include the additional 2 years of data to learn which states experienced the larger homicide increases. And obviously, if they were concentrated in those states without the firearm surrender laws, the evidence would be even stronger. The figure also, I'm just going to briefly note that notes which states have these laws, and I noted and looked up further Iowa's situation. It appears that it was passed in 2010, a restraining order relinquishment law in cases of IPV. And when Iowa passed its law, according to their model estimates, the effects were very small. But the reason the effects were very small is because Iowa's intimate partner homicide rate, gun homicide rate, is much lower than it is for the nation. And when you have a very low base rate, it's hard for a single law to make a large enough impact that would be notable. Doesn't mean it wasn't important, it just means that it wasn't a large effect, given where it had started from. So, of course, such laws also don't always result in compliance. Women may not often know whether partners or former partners have guns or how many they have. The success of the laws also depend on the extent to which noncompliance is handled effectively by law enforcement agencies, and clearly this is very difficult and can be very dangerous work. And moreover, highly motivated offenders whose guns have been surrendered are often likely to be able to obtain replacements through underground markets. And so these issues suggest just how important it is to have strong commitments from and resources for the criminal justice system to enforce these laws and to disrupt these types of underground markets. I'm out of time, so to keep moving on, there are other many other gender-related issues that could be discussed, but I think we're ready to move on to policy and to Professor Cook's comments.
Good evening, everybody. I am pleased to be here and pleased to see such a great turnout for this vital issue. I think my assignment was to talk about what works and what doesn't work in gun policy. And of course, there are book-length reports on that topic, each one of which covers in detail the kinds of evidence that Professor Lauritsen was going through on a single study. So I am not going to attempt that. But what I decided to do for this evening was to look at what I consider to be the foundations of gun policy. And in fact, am going with the term pillars. So the talk is about the 3 pillars of gun policy or gun violence prevention policy. Let me say that these pillars are foundational. They are what you believe or don't believe when it comes time to construct gun policy, and that you might consider one or more of them to be rather wobbly, as I will talk about very briefly. Certainly they are all controversial, as is absolutely everything about gun policy. So, okay, first pillar. First pillar is instrumentality. And instrumentality simply means that the type of weapon matters. And that in particular in a violent encounter, a violent act, the type of weapon that is used by the assailant is going to have an influence on the outcome of that attack, and that influence will be over and above whatever intention the attacker might have. The instrument matters all by itself. This is, for many people, hard to accept. You are familiar with the bumper strip that says, "Guns don't kill people, people kill people," suggesting that the type of weapon doesn't have anything to do with it. It is simply the person that's involved that matters. If you look at our criminal law, there certainly is a very great distinction depending on whether the victim lives or dies in a sustained attack, as if What is being punished there is the intention, which is assumed to be perfectly correlated with the act itself. But when you back up and look at the evidence, it turns out that there's all kinds of reason to think that it matters what weapon is in the hand of the attacker, that whether it's a knife or a pistol or perhaps a large caliber pistol or an AR-15 assault rifle, that those differences matter, and they will matter in a very particular way. They will determine or have a big influence on the likelihood that the victim is going to die. And certainly, if you look at the vital statistics, you can see that the death rate in knife attacks, even serious knife attacks, is far lower than the death rate with small caliber gun attacks, and that's lower than the death rate for attacks with large caliber pistols, and then you get up to the really serious weaponry, and there you have the possibility of mass shootings, which you have seen so much of in recent years. So I like to think of this in terms of, people kill people, but the type of weapon is relevant, and that the easier it is to kill someone, the more likely it's going to happen. That seems like a basic economic principle. I've done some research on that. I'd be glad to talk about it. Most recently, I did a study with Anthony Braga about homicide in Boston, and found out that if all of those gun homicides had been with the .22 caliber instead of the whole range of calibers up to 45, the homicide rate would have been reduced by 40%. So just the caliber of the gun was making that much difference, even though in other ways those attacks were identical for statistical purposes. All right, so certainly this is the single most important issue. If you don't believe this, then there's absolutely no reason to go on with the conversation, right? I mean, why bother? We shouldn't regulate guns. What difference does it make? And this separates the field in a way that was recently documented by the RAND Corporation. If you believe it, you're on one side. If you don't believe it, you're on the other. I would say it's something that needs to be studied more, but my own work and common sense would say it matters a lot. Okay. Instrumentality has also showed up in suicide as an issue that has gotten increasing attention. Partly it's gotten increasing attention because Harvard Public Health, under the leadership of Kathy Barber and David Hemingway there, have put together the Means Matter program, something I recommend to you, which is to say that they are trying to change the conversation around suicide so that it is no longer simply a discussion of why people are inclined to commit suicide, but also how. And train counselors that if they have a suicidal patient, they should be talking about the availability of lethal means, that they should certainly have that in mind, or the gun dealers should have that in mind when they're selling guns to somebody who says, well, I only need one bullet. I mean, there's cases like that. And so they're out actually training gun dealers about how to recognize suicidal individuals. The point is that a lot of suicides are impulsive, and that whether they happen or not depends on whether there are lethal means readily available. And that of all of the lethal means, the ones that are by far the most common are guns, 85% death rate in gun attacks. If you look at all of the other means put together, means that are used to attempt suicide and were serious enough to put the person in the emergency room, the death rate there is only 5%. So it's 85% versus 5%. A variety of other evidence supporting. So instrumentality is a big deal. The second pillar in this analysis, the second foundation is availability. And so when it comes time to talk about especially regulation on the supply of guns and the nature of guns that are available for sale, the terms on which they're available for sale, the documentation that is put into it. Certainly the impetus behind that is the belief that if you can make guns less available, especially to people who are dangerous to themselves or others, then that is going to reduce the use of guns and hence the death rate. And I think that this is an area where people who share a concern about gun violence often despair and they can't go on with the argument because of some version of the following. Well, there's 300 million guns, they're everywhere, there's nothing to be done, let's give up. So in response, I would say there's a lot of evidence that in fact, sure, there's 300 million guns in private hands, but they are scarce. And there's lots of people, including dangerous people, who would like to have a gun and would find it difficult to get one. In fact, only about 25 or 30% of the adult public owns a gun. Only maybe as much as 40%, if you're very generous with the statistics, 40% of the households. So the great majority do not own a gun. And if they're going to get a gun to commit suicide or to kill somebody, then there has to be a transaction. And that transaction is what we try to regulate for the most part with gun regulations. The idea that those transactions can be costly and difficult come out of surveys with criminals, including some that I've done. They come out of just the plain fact that if you look at the percentage of robberies that are committed with guns, it's only 25% in the street, even though a gun is absolutely the best weapon to use if you're going to commit a robbery. Apparently, the 75% of the robbers don't have a gun handy with them. And other kinds of evidence that come out of successful regulations. My favorite regulation that I believe is successful, even though it's very hard to study, is the National Firearms Act of 1934. If you remember your history, we had the 1920s that were roaring, and they were roaring because of the Tommy gun, which is a fully automatic submachine gun. And you have a picture of one over there on the screen. In 1934, Congress actually got around to almost ban them. What it did was it required that if you had a Tommy gun, you had to register it with the federal government, and that if you were going to sell it or give it to somebody else, you had to pay $200 tax to the federal government, and that was back in the days when $200 was real money. So what has happened since then is the use of automatic weapons has basically disappeared. I mean, we hear all kinds of things about semi-automatic assault weapons and that kind of thing. We don't hear about Tommy guns or the equivalent being used in crime or even in mass shootings. So it appears that perhaps it was the National Firearms Act that did the job, and we should see that as an availability lesson. Another one, Professor Lauritsen was talking about the regulations on domestic violence. There's very solid evidence that, for example, the Lautenberg Amendment of 1996 was effective in reducing killings with guns by abusers. And it appears that another case where simply making it illegal for a particular group of people to have a gun has been successful. Encouraging stuff. And going forward, there's a variety of other measures that, I don't know whether you would call these evidence-based or not, but they're reason-based. Certainly the red flag laws that say a family member or maybe the police can go to a judge if somebody is threatening to commit suicide with a gun or to kill somebody else or to shoot up their school, and that judge can then order a temporary removal of guns from that person. We have a third of the states now have these laws in place. It makes enormous good sense, especially if they're enforced. I think smart guns, which we don't have on the market yet but exist, would be another one where they are user authorized, and so that would way cut down on theft. It would cut down on unauthorized transfers within households, like where the teenage son decides to use dad's gun to commit suicide. That would not be possible. Certainly the ban on large magazines is very, very promising. So there's a variety of things that I think can be done once you accept the idea that availability matters, that are promising in this area. The third pillar is accountability. And unfortunately, that doesn't come up very often in discussions of gun violence prevention, but I think it should. My little crusade at the moment is to put law enforcement in the criminal justice system on the same footing as gun regulation and on a variety of public health measures that have been proposed, and say, people say we can't arrest our way out of gun violence, but the fact is we're not trying very hard. And it would be helpful, I think, that if somebody shot another person, they would have a reasonable belief that they would be arrested and convicted and punished. Right now, that we've seen a downward trend in the clearance rate by arrest for homicide over the last few decades, a de-emphasis by many police departments in detective work. We have some cities, including Chicago, for example, in 2016, where the overall clearance rate in shootings dropped below 10%. It was basically a situation where you could shoot somebody in Chicago with impunity. And that does not seem like a sound basis for building gun violence prevention. The mechanisms by which improved efforts in this area will work are deterrence. We'll hear more about that from the next talk. Certainly keeping dangerous people off the street if they get imprisoned through incapacitation. That's true because many gun crimes are repetitive, the same person acting over and over again. And also, I think, interrupting vigilante retaliation. After all, the criminal justice system is there to replace private action in this area. If the police aren't doing their job, then it's not going to, and it leaves it to the gangs to take care of business. There are a lot of things that could be done to improve clearance rates by arrest. I'm working with the Chicago Police Department right now on one approach. One is simply to give higher priority to non-fatal shootings, upgrade them to the same level as fatal shootings. There's very little to choose between them in terms of deterrence and incapacitation. I think we can have greatly improved technical support, and that's what we're doing in Chicago right now to assist detectives in reading video and doing other things that they have trouble with. I think that there are regulations. That's not a different world entirely that would help solve shootings. And I mentioned here registration, which sounds like pie in the sky. But not so pie in the sky would be micro-stamping of shell casings with pistols, which California now has on the books. And then finally, since ultimately you need eyewitness testimony to improve community relations, all of those I think could help improve the clearance rate. So those are the pillars that I have in mind, that the foundation, its instrumentality, its accountability, and its availability. I think that if you accept those three and accept the evidence, which I think the direct evidence on those is quite strong, then that will make you more optimistic about the possibility of getting control over what is really one of the major debits on our standard of living in this country. Thank you very much.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I'm going to talk about something a little bit different. I'm going to talk about urban violence. And urban violence is the sort of intersection of gun violence, gang violence, youth violence, street violence. It's all those interconnected concepts melded together. And the reason I want to discuss that is because urban violence is simultaneously the most serious in terms of pure lethality form of gun violence, and it's also the most solvable. And so I want to talk about that. And just so we understand, in the United States, we like to talk about gun violence as a single unitary phenomenon. But in fact, there are at least 4 separate but connected types of gun violence. Urban violence, which is going to be the focus of this talk. Domestic violence, which we heard a little bit about previously. Mass shootings, which we also heard a bit about. And then suicides. Those are the 4 largest categories. And it's important to recognize that a solution for one type of violence is not necessarily a solution for the others. Here we're going to be talking specifically about urban violence. So I want to begin with a metaphor. Consider yourselves emergency room surgeons in an urban hospital late at night on a weekend. And a young man is wheeled in on a gurney. And that young man has been shot and he's unconscious. The bullet has clipped the femoral artery in his leg, which is one of the largest arteries in the body, and he's losing a lot of blood quickly. So the question to all of you is, what do you do? Or maybe more specifically, what do you do first? You take a look at the young man. His clothes look shabby and unkempt. He's likely led a life of deprivation. He may be jobless, homeless, lacking a decent education. So maybe what this young man needs is an apartment, or he needs to know where his next meal is coming for, or he needs mentoring to get his GED. On the other hand, the young man has been involved in some kind of conflict. And so when he recovers consciousness, he might be dangerous. So maybe the first thing you should do is put him in restraints, or maybe you should call hospital security or even 911. Now, what I would suggest is that none of you would do any of those things. You would do the most obvious, the most immediate, and the most humane thing, which is first, you would stop the bleeding. Because unless you stop the bleeding, the young man would die. And the argument I want to make today is that we should treat urban violence as a nation the way we would treat a gunshot wound in the emergency room. So let's talk about the high price of urban violence. First, in 2018, the last year for which we have official data, there were over 16,000 murders in the United States. The majority of those were due to urban violence, anywhere from probably 65 to 75% of all homicides are urban violence related. Each murder costs society an astronomical $10 to $19 million per homicide. And that's putting aside that the direct costs to victims, to their friends, to their family members are absolutely immeasurable. But when you add up all the law enforcement costs, all the medical costs, but importantly, all the intangible costs of fear and avoidance, decreased property values, increased insurance premiums, higher taxes, all of these different things, you get this extraordinarily high number. And this is a figure that we are all paying, not just everyone in society, not just those who are directly impacted. But when we're talking about the people who are most impacted, other than obviously the victims themselves, it may be poor children who are impacted most. And we've learned this from Raj Chetty, a colleague of mine from Harvard. In his landmark income mobility studies, he found that there was a significant association between outcomes for children with low-income families and lower rates of violence. Meaning, for poor children controlling other things, if they lived in more violent neighborhoods, it was harder for them to escape poverty. Now, as we all know, correlation doesn't necessarily equal causation. But then we had Pat Sharkey, formerly from Columbia and now at Princeton, who came along and took that work to the next level using something called an instrumental variable analysis to show a causal if-then, before-after connection, showing that when poor children are impacted by violence, it directly impacts their future life incomes and life outcomes. And so how does that actually work? Here's how it works. Chronic exposure to violence in childhood traumatizes children. And that trauma makes it harder for children to sleep. It makes it harder for them to focus. It makes it harder for them to behave. And all of these things directly impact their performance in school. And over time, there's even studies that show that students who have been exposed to a shooting, if their IQ is tested shortly after, there's a marked reduction in their IQ. Now, violence doesn't make children any less intelligent, but what it means is that violence is occupying their minds. And if it's occupying their minds, then other things can't get through. And if you see that chronically over years, it's directly impacting these children's academic performance, and that's ultimately impacting their life outcomes. So I want to talk about two strategies that show great promise in actually reducing this form of violence. And I want to talk first about how we know this. We're not talking, this isn't an argument that I'm making. What I want to talk about is the results of an analysis that my colleague Chris Rinship and I from Harvard did, where we wrapped our arms around all of the causal evidence, the most highest quality impact evaluation evidence that we could find. Over 1,400 discrete studies that were quasi-experimental or experimental in nature, meaning these are the most rigorous types of studies. And we tried to find out what strategies were really effective in reducing urban violence. Again, not domestic violence or mass shootings or these other things, but urban violence specifically. And we found a few strategies that were quite effective. The first is focused deterrence. And focused deterrence relies on police-community partnerships that get together, identify who the people in a jurisdiction, the people who are most likely to shoot or be shot, and then they confront those individuals through a series of meetings, small group meetings called call-ins, and they give them this dual message of empathy and accountability. And what they say to these individuals is they say, we know you're doing the shooting, and it has to stop. If the shooting stops, we're here to help you. And if the shooting persists, we're here to stop you. And they make this very clear offer of assistance and promise of punishment. And then they follow up on both of those things. And what we can see is that not only are the individuals who are in those call-ins and experience those messages less likely to commit acts of urban violence later on, people in their network, that they know are also less likely. Not the impact is much weaker, but it has a knock-on effect among people in their network. A systematic review synthesizing all of the results on this particular strategy was performed in 2018, and there were 25 tests, meaning 25 individual tests of this strategy, and 19 of 24 were successful, showing noteworthy crime reduction effects. Now, I don't expect anybody in this audience to understand effect sizes, what 0.657 means, but let me just tell you, in our work, an effect size of 0.657 is enormous. And it translates to reductions in shootings and killings of 40%, 50%, 60%. And so that's the type of results that you can get with this strategy. Another very popular strategy is something called street outreach. The most well-known version of this is called Cure Violence. And street outreach depends on outreach workers, often former offenders themselves, to identify and then engage high-risk individuals and to mediate potential conflicts. They have credibility. They're often called credible messengers because they're from the same neighborhoods. They might even be from the same from the same gangs. And what they try to do is, because so much of this violence is retaliatory. You heard this. You heard the statistics that a large number of these of the perpetrators are known to the victims. Because so much of this violence is retaliatory, a beating leads to a shooting leads to a killing, and so on and so forth. A lot of the name of the game in this area is preventing retaliation and escalation in violence. So that's what they do. Overall, there's been no systematic review performed yet, although I have to say myself and several colleagues have one underway. But based on the studies that we have to date, probably 7 or 8 so far, there's a mixed but promising record of success. When this approach is implemented effectively with sufficient resources in the appropriate ways, with a lot of support and rigor, it tends to work. But when it's not implemented effectively, and it's implemented sort of in half measures, or with not a lot of thought or careful planning, it doesn't work. And in some cases, it can actually increase homicide. So that's something to keep in mind. And so really what we need is to move street outreach from the promising category to the proven category, which I would argue that focused deterrence is in that proven category. We need greater systemization and professionalization of this approach. The best approaches to this are now started in Los Angeles and are now moving to Chicago. And what they do is they have a street outreach academy, a 6-month training session where if you want to do this type of work, you have to go through a course for 6 months and make sure that you really know what you're doing. And then everyone who goes through that is now a licensed practitioner, and they can do the practice. One of the key things that they do is they teach you the do's and don'ts of street outreach, and there is a right way and a wrong way to do this. But very importantly, they teach you how to coordinate with law enforcement. It's very important to this work that people remain independent of law enforcement, but you can't be adversarial. And so understanding that difference is really important. Now, what's driving the effectiveness of these strategies? There are several principles that I detail in the book that's outside these halls here. A quiet plug, Bleeding Out, great book. But one of the key principles is the principle of focus. And focus is important because of this foundational observation we have about urban violence, which is that it's sticky, meaning that it clusters among surprisingly small numbers of people and places. It's not just concentrated, it's hyper-concentrated. And so when you think of urban violence and you think, oh, this is going to be, in a city like where I'm from, Boston, this must involve thousands of individuals spread out about multiple neighborhoods and widely dispersed. No. In fact, in Boston, the Boston Regional Intelligence Center has identified about 400 individuals who are driving disproportionately 40, 50, 60% of the gun violence in the city of Boston. And this finding is replicated throughout many, many cities in the United States. And it's not being driven through the sort of quote-unquote poor neighborhoods of Boston, Roxbury, Mattapan, Dorchester. It's being driven by very small subsections, micro-locations known as hotspots, a particular housing project, a particular liquor store where the shootings are happening again and again and again. And in fact, 5% of your geography in many cities is generating 50% of your crime and much more than your violent crime. And here what you have is a network analysis. All of these white dots on the left are people, and all of these lines between them are arrests, meaning these are people who are connected by criminal activity and arrests and police data. And the red dots are shootings. And what you can see is, number one, the shootings are happening among these clusters of people. There's this concentration and effect. And then think about, if the name of the game is reducing retaliation, think about what this analysis leads you. If you see a red dot here, you don't have to deal with all of these people. You have to go right quickly to those connections and try to talk those people down. Either threaten them with sanctions or say, hey, you've got to leave this alone. That's the demographic concentration. In terms of geography, this is New Orleans. New Orleans has a very high rate of violence, but look at where the violence is concentrated, these heat maps. In very small, discrete locations, even in a violent city like New Orleans, the violence is extremely concentrated. So what I want to argue is that there's this conventional story about urban violence, and it's a somewhat hopeless story, which is that We have this ugly legacy of racism and racial persecution in this country that led to intense racial segregation, ultimately produced concentrated poverty, and then led to high rates of social dysfunction, of crime and violence. And that story, unfortunately, is true. But there is another story, which is a more optimistic story, and for which there is equally strong empirical evidence. And that's that causal pathway, that causal relationship runs in reverse. And that high rates of crime and violence, if we can reduce them, can reduce concentrated poverty, can reduce racial segregation, and ultimately racism itself. What I want you to understand is that unlike these other forms of violence, domestic violence, mass shootings, and other things, for urban violence, we know what works, and the strategies that work don't require a lot of money, they don't require new laws, and they don't even require massive institutional reform. So the good news is that we have a very serious problem, but we can do something about it. Thank you.
Wanted to mention, I've been asked to remind you, perhaps you saw on the way in, that these books from two of our guests today are out for sale. Philip Cook's book, he co-authored The Gun Debate, What Everyone Needs to Know, as well as Thomas App's Bleeding Out, out front, available for sale. It's a tremendous pleasure for Iowa Public Radio to be involved in this symposium, The Burden of Gun Violence, Trends and Policy Solutions. And I want to thank Vice President Marty Schultz, Pete Damiano, Mark Berg of the University of Iowa Public Policy Center. So happy to be a partner here. And what this means is that while a couple hundred of you came out tonight, showed your engagement and your concern about this, that we are partnered because Iowa Public Radio is involved. We can reach tens of thousands, several tens of thousands of ears that we wouldn't have otherwise been able to reach. So this part of the program is about being interactive with you, the audience. And as you noticed coming in, there were note cards. I hope you got one. If you didn't, raise your hand. Leslie and others will be there to facilitate that. Write down your questions. Please, I would highly encourage block lettering, even though I was trained in cursive. It's just a little bit easier to read. So bring up your questions. When you have a question, hold up your card, and that will be collected, and we'll get to as many as we can during the course of the next hour or so. An edited version of tonight's conversation, sort of this half of the evening, will be broadcast tomorrow over noon on Iowa Public Radio. And it will be posted as a podcast soon thereafter at iowapublicradio.org. And how do we know whether our Iowa Public Radio listeners think a conversation is valuable? We receive feedback about it. A lot of you are engaged in this and are very concerned about gun violence. Please pass the podcast around, react to it. If we hear more about this, that tells us that conversations about gun violence are needed and valued in our Iowa Public Radio community. I want to start off by giving those of us here a sense of who we are, and those of us listening on the radio with a sense of our personal connections to gun violence. Think about this a minute. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to clap if you, your family, or a member of an extended family, your extended family, have been affected by gun violence. Okay? Clap if you have been affected, you or your family have been affected by gun violence. Okay, a significant number in this audience of about 200 people. 36,000 Americans approximately killed by guns each year, an average of 100 per day approximately. So what we're going to do with our guests here, they have been involved in this symposium and giving you some very valuable detailed research, but now we're going to, rather than the fine points that they've been making, sort of try to brush with some broader strokes and answer some questions that you may all have. Hand those questions up when you have those, to those in the aisles as well. I'm going to start off by having our panelists introduce themselves. They were introduced at the beginning, but introduce themselves in their own words, limited to, let's say, up to a minute. Each of our panelists, tell us who you are, a little bit about your background, and your expertise in this area, what you bring to the table in this panel discussion. Thomas Apt, may I start with you at the end of the panel?
Sure. I'm Thomas Apt. I'm a senior research fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. But over the past 20 years, I've been exploring the issue of gun violence as a teacher, as a prosecutor, and as a government official before I joined academia.
Okay, let's move on to Philip Cook of Duke. Tell us about yourself, Philip.
I am Philip Cook. I'm a professor of public policy and economics at Duke University. And I studied the economics of crime back in graduate school days. And one thing or another, I got interested in the early 1970s in the particular problem of gun violence and how weapons were used in violent crime. I discovered later that made me the second person on earth to be studying gun violence systematically. The first one being Frank Zimmering, a law professor. So I've been at it off and on ever since then. Studied a variety of topics on gun markets, for example, in my current work that I talked about that has to do with improving clearance rates against shooters. But I think that the one thing that has really stood out in my career is the investigation that I did with Jens Ludwig about the costs of gun violence and why it is that we should care about this topic. And the answer that we came to is very much about not just the loss of life and the disability, although that surely is important, but also about the effects on community and the devastation that is wreaked on neighborhoods that are heavily impacted by gun violence. So I would say that perspective is something that I think we can all agree on and form a basis for moving ahead in the discussion. This is important.
Thank you, Philip Cook. Next to Philip, Janet Lauritsen. Tell us about yourself, Janet, and your angle on gun violence.
Hi, my name is Janet Lauritsen. I'm a Curators professor at the University of Missouri in St. Louis, and I study criminology and sociology. I come to this field fairly recently, certainly compared to my colleagues here. I've been studying victimization for the last 30 years, most of my career, and was pleased to see over the years improvements in persons' risk for victimization, non-lethal forms, and it wasn't until recently when I realized that lethality was going up that I became much more concerned that some of the good things that had happened in terms of violence were being undone by guns, and so I've turned my attention to that recently.
Thank you, Janet. Richard Rosenfeld at the end of our panel table here. Tell us about yourself and how you view gun violence.
Well, I don't like gun violence. I've been studying violence, specifically changes over time and rates of violence throughout my now 35-year career as a criminologist. I'm at the University of Missouri St. Louis, though I'm emeritus, meaning I no longer teach, I just focus on my research. And again, I've spent most of my career studying trends in violence. More recently, I've done some studies of policing effects on violence. I'm from St. Louis, as is Dr. Lauritsen. Ferguson, Missouri is, we used to live right on the Ferguson line. It's a suburb of St. Louis. I've done some work on the so-called Ferguson effect. I haven't found a whole lot of evidence for it, and happy to talk about that in Q&A. And my most recent work focuses on the connection between the opioid epidemic and homicide in the United States.
Okay, now that we got to know a little bit of who we are in this hall, who our panelists are, I would like to turn to our panelists and have you sort of characterize, before we get to some audience questions, where are we now in this point in time in our country when we talk about gun violence and remedies for gun violence? Are we at some kind of juncture? What kind of trends have been shaping attitudes about gun violence and remedies recently? I see you, Richard, there nodding your head. Let's start with you. I don't know how many of the panelists will want to respond to this. Richard Rosenfeld.
Well, you know, you might not be able to tell from this evening's conversation or from watching the nightly news, but we're in a comparatively good spot in the United States with respect to gun violence. Gun violence has gone down over time. Since the early 90s, it's gone down conservatively by 40%. If we look at non-lethal gun violence, it's gone down even more. It still remains at undesirably high levels, of course, especially when we compare ourselves to other nations in many respects like ourselves, but not in this respect. But we're in a sufficiently good spot that the conversation about criminal justice has turned away from the violence problem and turned toward the criminal justice problem, mass incarceration in particular. We've seen remarkable, certainly in my lifetime, and actually, given current events, remarkable cooperation across partisan lines with respect to undoing some of the effects of mass incarceration. We wouldn't be here now if we were still obsessed with the problem of gun violence, as we were, and as my colleagues recall, in the mid to late 80s and through the 90s. So in that sense, we're in a good spot. With respect, however, to the policy options that are politically feasible, no, we're not in such a good spot. And I'll leave that one to my more policy-oriented colleagues.
Okay, Thomas Apt, I saw you nodding at the end of the table. Where are we, in your view, in terms of evaluating and finding remedies for gun violence?
Well, I would second all of Rick's comments, but I would also just note that a lot of this depends on your baseline. So if you look back 25 years, the progress in terms of gun violence is remarkable. But if you go back another 25 years, we have roughly the same homicide rates we did in the 60s. And that means that after 50 years, we've made no progress. And we remain an outlier, an ugly outlier, among high-income nations with a homicide rate that's 7 times higher than other wealthy nations, driven by a gun homicide rate that is 25 times higher.
Philip.
So on the policy front, I think that what is hanging over us is the possibility that we're one vote away from a Supreme Court that is going to tear down the structure of gun control measures that we have right now. So if RBG dies, succumbs to her cancer, yeah.
So explain a little bit more, Philip. What happens then? What do you see? How will it make a difference to the people in this room, the people listening to the radio?
Well, I think that the situation with the court right now is that it's split more or less 4-4-1. The one being Roberts, the Chief Justice. 4 of them may be ready to have a very radical interpretation of the Second Amendment and require strict review on any kind of legislation which may then tear down the federal and state laws that we have in place, such as they are. And then there are 4 that are generally would cede to legislatures a decision about how much to regulate guns, and then Roberts in the middle. But if one of the 4 more liberal justices dies, then I think that what that means is that the court will have ruled in a way that will make it very difficult to use regulation as a tool for gun violence prevention.
Anything to add on the point of where we are? Let's move on to the first of our audience questions. I'll remind our radio listeners that you're listening to part of a symposium on gun violence, the burden of gun violence, trends and policy solutions. I'm Ben Kiefer, with the pleasure of moderating a part of this symposium that evaluates where we are in terms of gun violence, the trends, and also some possible policy solutions. About 200 people here in Iowa City this evening engaged in this conversation, and we'll be asking for more questions and getting to as many as we can as we talk with our panelists, Thomas Abt of Harvard, Philip Cook of Duke, and Janet Lauritsen and Richard Rosenfeld of the University of Missouri, St. Louis. Let's go to a question here. This is for Thomas Abt. The question for you, Thomas: will the solutions you discussed, and this refers to part of the symposium prior to this, when you talked about urban violence, will the solutions you discussed for dealing with gun violence work in a smaller, quote, urban area like Iowa City or other towns in Iowa?
The answer, these urban violence strategies, things like focused deterrence, street outreach, other very targeted programmatic approaches to reducing urban violence, is yes, they will. They will work in any urban community, because in any urban community the violence is similarly concentrated, and so these very focused solutions will be equally effective. So as long as you have urban violence driven by a small number of people in a small number of places, which is overwhelmingly true across the nation's cities, small, medium, or large, these strategies will work.
Next question, rather lengthy here. Generally, gun homicides have steadily declined for the last 30 years, and yet gun ownership in America has increased at a similar rate. I understand that correlation does not equal causation, but what should we make of this inverse relationship? Does this suggest, the audience member writes, that gun policy is a treatment of proverbial symptoms, gun deaths, and not the disease, mental health, cultural trends? Who would like to answer that? Richard.
Well, I'll start. I want to question one of the premises of the audience member's question. No, it is not the case, and as Professor Cook pointed out earlier, it is not the case that the prevalence of gun ownership has gone up in the United States over the last 30 or so years. In fact, household gun ownership has come down from its peak levels some time ago. Now, how does that square, though, with what we hear on the news about record levels of gun sales that during the Obama administration or after a mass shooting? The way the two square is that persons who are driving those gun sales are persons who already own a gun and are trading in a gun for another or adding to their collection. But household gun ownership has not been going up over time.
Okay, any other input on that question before we move on? Next questioner here in our audience asks, is a constitutional amendment the only true solution? I guess interpret that as you will. Thomas?
I think the answer is clearly no. Based on my research, there are programmatic solutions that don't even require legislation that can significantly reduce homicide. It can't reduce all forms of homicide, and we need to understand that urban homicide is not the same as domestic homicide, and it's not the same as mass shootings, as I've said before. But no, you need, this is a very complex and persistent phenomenon, and so you need multiple strategies at the programmatic, legal, and systems level. So there's really no one silver bullet, and certainly not a constitutional amendment.
Widen this question out to just talk about what are the most effective policies for reducing gun violence. What do we know about that?
Well, I'll take a crack at that. In terms of the most compelling evidence is in reference to urban violence, where we have dozens, if not hundreds, of quasi-experimental or experimental studies that have shown that there are a family of strategies, perhaps 5 or 10 strategies in total, that fairly reliably reduce urban violence. And one of the most prominent I talked about was focused deterrence. Another one is cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy is a leading technique in reducing recidivism among high-risk offenders. Another is hotspots policing and other strategies like that. In addition, those are sort of demand-side solutions. They reduce the demand for weapons, particularly illegal weapons. On the supply side, I think the most promising evidence is coming out of Johns Hopkins University around purchase-to-permit laws, and these are laws broadly known as gun licensing laws. And these laws are on the sort of common sense notion that we should regulate guns perhaps as much as we regulate cars. And what we see is that in the states that either adopt these laws or then take them down, as in the case of Missouri, you see significant increases or decreases in violence based on that. If you take a permit to purchase law away, you see a significant increase. If you take if you implement a new permit to purchase law, you see a significant decrease. And interestingly, that decrease is across all forms of gun violence, including, I should point out, police violence and violence against police.
Philip.
Yeah, let me just add to that. I think that sometimes you don't know what you've lost till it's gone, as somebody once said. And so that one of the areas where we are learning that we've lost something is in controlling concealed carry. Certainly, when I started paying attention to this, most all of the states, with the remarkable exception of Vermont, regulated concealed carry or banned it, and the regulations were quite stringent. That was true in North Carolina. It was true throughout the country. Those regulations have, for the most part, been weakened or blown away entirely. And what we are discovering now from what I think is the best research is that the result has been an increase in violence in the streets. And so that the old ways were the best ways in that case, far from putting guns on the street as a deterrent to violence, in fact, has made it worse. The other thing where there is increasing evidence that we made a mistake was on the ban on the assault weapons and on large capacity magazines that was in place for 10 years. Not only did the repeal of that ban or allowing it to sunset harm Mexico, it also appears to have made a big difference in terms of mass shootings in this country. And going forward, what it suggests is that regulating carrying and regulating large capacity magazines are two things that work. Now we know.
Let me turn to Janet Lauritsen's expertise here, because your research is very interesting as you look at the victims of gun violence and also gender in gun violence. Inform us a little bit about your research in this area and how it's shaping the debate, you feel.
That's an interesting question. I don't know if it is shaping a debate. The research is clear that, in my view, that given the fact that men are overwhelmingly the perpetrators of gun violence compared to women. It's kind of the large elephant in the room. We have a problem with men that
Not uttered for the first time,
No.
I would say.
so, and by that I mean that there's some things about masculinity that need to be better understood so we can understand what it is about gun ownership and use. I mean, women do own guns as well, but they're much clearer in their view that it's for protection rather than for retaliation and for enacting justice.
Among women.
Among women. When the other aspect of gender and gun violence at the incident level that I think is interesting, and I'm going to put to the side intimate partner violence as a separate category here, but when it comes to street violence, when male perpetrators have a gun, let's say in a robbery or in some other type of street crime, carjacking, et cetera, if it's a potential female victim, they're less likely to kill and injure the female victim because they do not view women as a threat. Men view other men as a threat, and I think that especially if they fear those other men may be armed or may not be cooperative, and I think that's something that we should all think a little bit more about in terms of how it is that we have come to this position, whether it's because we believe there's so much proliferation of weapons that it's hopeless and this is the only way to respond and protect oneself and to take justice into one's own hands, or whether or not that's something about the way we raise our sons.
Perhaps you answered this as another question from one of our audience members. Why is homicide more common among males than females? What is it? What do we know about maleness that does this?
You guys know more than I do about this.
Three males on the panel, one female. We should be able to come up with some good answers here. Thomas, you look like you're ready to answer.
Well, looks can be deceiving. I would broaden the question, which is why are men predisposed to commit the overwhelming majority of all violence in terms of physical violence? It is true that men are responsible for close to 90% of homicides here in the United States. The number is similar all across the world, so this is a universal phenomenon. But it's not restricted to homicide or to gun homicide or to gun violence. It's violence generally. And I think that really the people who are best able to talk about this are the hard sciences, the biologists, the anthropologists, and those people are probably better equipped to sort of discuss some of those things. I think that whatever the underlying sources of masculine violence, I think one of the things that we have to understand, and I constantly want to bring us back to, is that proximate causes matter as much or more than these deep root and structural causes. So meaning that you don't have to wait till you understand the primordial origin of violence. You don't need to wait until we solve all poverty, all racism, eliminate all guns from the world everywhere to make a meaningful impact on violence. We should be approaching violence in many cases from the inside out, not the outside in.
Let me ask this question, because we have a number of questions who refer to how we compare with the rest of the world. I'll just pick this one, and I'm sure that some of the other answers will come here from the other questions. Which gun-related policies have worked in other countries? Do you think any of those would be effective in the U.S.? And the questioner puts down total bans, background checks, permit requirements, registration, etc. What can we learn from other countries around the world? And earlier in the symposium, we put up a PowerPoint slide that showed how different we are from the rest of the world, not in a little, small, marginal way. We are in a completely different league when it comes to gun violence. Richard.
Yeah. Well, to begin with, policies that appear to be quite effective are policies in some countries that require persons to store their guns outside the home, or if stored in the home, to be, in effect, under lock and key. And others on the panel can enumerate on those policies that are found elsewhere. But I think an important question, perhaps a prior question, is why is it that other countries have such policies and we find it so difficult to enact even policies that are quite a bit weaker? We hear quite a bit about a tradition of gun ownership in a frontier society and with the myth of the West and all that. I think that may be part of the answer, but only part. I think an equally important question to which policies have worked in other countries is why is it that other countries have effective policies and we don't?
I think I'd just like to comment on one particular policy because it's been in the news lately, and that's the massive buybacks of assault weapons. And I think that the evidence is suggestive that that policy, a broad-based gun buyback, assault weapon buyback, was successful in Australia, and that it might soon be successful in New Zealand. However, I have extreme doubts about its feasibility both politically and operationally here in the United States. There are simply too many guns with too little information about who has them. And we are currently doing an extremely poor job. We do gunbacks, small-scale gunbacks, all the time in the United States, and they're one of the most famously ineffective approaches to gun violence.
Why?
Because when you do a gun buyback, the kinds of guns you get are typically old, inoperable, broken guns, grandmas finding a gun in the attic. They're not crime guns. And so they're not guns that were likely to be used in the commission of a violent offense. And in fact, one of the things that we, some of the research that Janet just covered is that we actually do a remarkably poor job in recovering weapons that are already prohibited if a person has committed a domestic violence offense or under a red flag law. We're not doing well on the very, very minimal gun retrieval laws that we have today. So there's really not a lot of hope in terms of this broad-based buyback.
Richard Rosenfeld, you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, just a footnote on the comment that these are famously ineffective programs. Indeed, they are. I did a study of a gun buyback program in St. Louis some years ago, and we found no impact of the program on gun violence. But as part of the larger study, we conducted a survey of people who were turning in their guns for cash. And one of the questions we asked is, what are you going to do with the cash you received for your gun? And a large proportion of respondents said, buy a new gun.
Wow. This question in our audience is referring to, well, if you've been listening to Iowa Public Radio or other news over the last few years, you know stand your ground laws have been in the news quite a bit. This questioner asks, now Iowa does have stand your ground law in addition to how many other states? Someone off the top of your head, do the majority of states?
Oh, yeah.
Yes, okay,
Approaching
agreement
40,
there.
yeah.
If we don't have a number, we have the majority of states. The question, do you think stand your ground laws are either a cause or effect of the increased gun violence, is I guess what we mean? Stand your ground laws. What is the impact of stand your ground laws that have been enacted in the last few years? Richard?
Yeah, there have been some studies suggesting that stand your ground laws may have contributed to increases in homicide. But those the methodology is relatively weak. I don't think stand your ground laws have had an important impact on homicide rates. I think stand your ground laws, however, are undesirable in a number of other respects. I think they much too greatly enlarge the concept of self-defense. They enlarged the so-called, they're based originally on the so-called castle doctrine, which permits a person to defend his or her immediate home and family. Quote-unquote, defending oneself out in public based, depending on the state, based simply on one's own perception that one could be in danger. That's not self-defense. That goes well beyond self-defense. So on that basis, I have issues with those laws, but I don't think there's evidence I'm aware of that they've contributed much to overall homicide rates.
Recent trend in Iowa gun law, too, is expanding gun access in public places, that you're able to carry in a number of places. There are concealed weapons everywhere. A couple of years ago, I was part of as part of my work, part of a day-long carry conceal class, and at one point in the class, the instructor brought out an assistant, and she actually had been going between, approximately 24 of the students there the whole time, handing out flyers and helping out, and all of a sudden, the instructor at the head of the class said, "Is she carrying?" And we looked at her for the first time. Kind of a loose blouse on. Maybe she is, maybe she isn't. Wait, there's something kind of with an edge poking out of the back. She's carrying. As it turned out, she had about 6 different weapons on her, all the way down to a very pretty pink Derringer, which she was very proud of. So going back to the question here about gun access, expanding gun access in public places, will it decrease gun violence or open the floodgates if people are allowed to carry guns in certain areas? What is the relationship there? Janet, I see you reacting to this. I don't know if that's a reaction of telling us something, or what are your thoughts here?
I have thoughts. I don't have research on this. I mean, I don't think we have research on this. All I can say is that most people would prefer to be in a venue, let's say in a large crowd, in which they were confident that no one had a gun, as opposed to thinking that 60 or 80% of the people in that venue had a gun. I think it's a common sense argument, and I think, it could be, I suppose, tested empirically in an experimental study, though that would be unethical. Right. But I cannot see the logic of an arms race solving a gun violence problem.
But we have to recognize that many in our country do feel safer with more guns among the population, right?
And I would ask, how much
is that a myth?
Safer are they actually?
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Well, and Phil Cook
Richard
acknowledged or made reference to some research on shall carry and related laws. And, I won't speak for Phil, but my reading of that research suggests that, if anything, the ease with which people can carry guns in public, either openly or concealed, is probably associated with some increase in gun violence. But the idea that the more people who are carrying guns, the less gun violence we're going to have, I think that idea has been pretty thoroughly debunked.
Thomas.
So I also just want to point out something, which is that that these conversations are often massively out of whack with the actual rate at which people lose their lives in this country. Mass shootings, which is really what this conversation is revolving around, account for about 2% of all gun deaths in the United States. The number one victim of violent crime and homicide in the United States is young black men. So what that and these laws will not apply one way or another to the violence that is occurring in those communities. And so I think we need to reorient this discussion and at least provide some share of balance. I'm not suggesting that because urban violence accounts for 60 to 70% of all homicides, that because it has by far the strongest empirical base, because it can be addressed with very little resources, no new legislation, and widespread, that this is the only thing we discuss. But let's give it equal time.
you just joined us via podcast or the radio, this is Iowa Public Radio. I'm Ben Kiefer. You're hearing part of a symposium taking place in Iowa City, recorded in Iowa City, The Burden of Gun Violence, Trends and Policy Solutions. Taking part, Thomas Abt of Harvard, Philip Cook of Duke, Janet Lauritsen, and Richard Rosenfeld of the University of Missouri in St. Louis. And we're answering questions from the audience members here at this symposium and trying to figure out what we all want to have happen would be a reduction in gun violence, very controversial of what should be the path to get there. Let me ask this question. We've been, up to this point, talking a lot about what seems to be sort of exploding myths or testing ideas that we have about gun violence and its causes. What about this one? Are gun regulations keeping guns out of the hands of people who should not have them? Does gun policy keep them away from guns? Or does it only keep away guns or make it harder for law-abiding citizens we really shouldn't have to worry about, keep it out of their hands and put up hurdles there unnecessarily?
That sounds like your question.
Yeah, I'm glad to take that. I mean, I guess the first thing to be said is that since the Brady Law was enacted in 1994, there have been 3 million people who attempted to buy a gun and were turned back as a result of background checks. And who knows what they represent in terms of potential gun violence. Surely some of them found other ways to get a gun along the way, and some of them would have turned out to be not that much of a threat. But 3 million is a big number, and so that on the face of it, it appears that there is something going for this system of background checks and at least putting some barrier in the direction of trying to keep people who are disqualified for good reason, by reason of their criminal records and other characteristics that they have. And I think that, again, when we look at the domestic violence literature, my reading of that literature is probably more sanguine than Janet's. I think we have very solid evidence that the 1996 laws that prohibited misdemeanor domestic violence from possessing a gun actually did save lives in substantial numbers, and that's making a difference. So we're seeing in a variety of areas the potential for this approach. It's not foolproof by any means. We have a gaping loophole in terms of background checks with private transactions. But it seems like it has been a step in the right direction. And I, for one, would think it was a sad day if the Supreme Court said we could no longer do that.
Thomas, are you wanting to get on? Should we move on?
Sure. I just want to build on Phil's comments here. I think that, in Phil's previous comments, he talked about these pillars of instrumentality and access. And I think it's important to sort of understand in other areas of gun violence, aside from urban violence, where I think we have a lot of solid evidence, just because we don't have solid evidence doesn't mean we have to wait and be paralyzed with inaction. Because I think if you look, broadly speaking, across multiple studies with multiple methodologies and multiple data sets, there is a clear direction that all of those studies, with very, very few exceptions, and the exceptions often turn out to be discredited later on, which is that the more guns, the more serious guns you have access to, the more likely you are to have violence. Now, do we have rigorous randomized controlled trials in every instance on every single one of these laws? No, we don't. But that's the clear direction of the research. And we should note that one of the reasons that we don't have this research is because it has been systematically opposed. The funding of this research has been systematically opposed for at least 2 decades. So it's not just an accident that we don't have this research. It's been prevented. This research has really been stifled.
Explain that. When you say stifled or prevented in academia, what does that mean? If you are a researcher wanting to do research on gun violence in this country, what does that mean that you're prevented?
Well, researchers often depend on various sources of funding, but one of the largest sources of funding is federal funding for research. And in the 90s, there was an amendment passed known as the Dickey Amendment, which was an amendment that basically restricted the use of budget authority or research dollars to not engage in advocacy. And it was related to the Center for Disease Control that did a lot of this work. That's what the amendment said on its face. But what it actually did was it was a warning shot from legislators to the CDC, essentially saying, if you continue to fund this research, we will defund you. And so while that's not what the technical language says, the unmistakable signal was that. And in fact, what happened? The CDC stopped doing that research. And so that's something that's very important to understand.
We have a few more minutes left, and I wanted to make sure we got into an area that we haven't touched on yet, really, significantly, red flag laws and mental health as it pertains to this debate. First of all, who can encapsulate red flag laws? What do they mean?
Red flag laws.
Oh, sure.
Philip?
So red flag laws have been adopted by 17 states and the District of Columbia last time I looked. They take the general form that it creates the possibility of petitioning the court to remove guns from the hands of somebody who is dangerous to themselves or to others. And to do that removal on a temporary basis that can be challenged within a specified period of time. The people who have standing to go to the judge and petition differ from state to state. In some states, it's only law enforcement. In other states, it includes family members. California has actually flirted with the possibility of pushing it to teachers and including other kinds of people. So that differs, and as does the exact details of it. But that's the basic setup. When it's implemented, what we've seen is crazy variability from state to state in how much it's used, and even from county to county. So in Florida, which is probably the most active user right now, it's really Broward. I mean, there's a couple of counties where it's used actively and others not, and we see the same thing. So it seems to be very much a local discretion kind of issue.
But worth pursuing. Worth pursuing, does the panel agree? Because I say this because it seems to be a place where Democratic and Republican lawmakers appear to be trying to reach some common ground.
So I think another way of saying what Phil is saying is that a lot of the effectiveness of these laws depends on implementation. Mm-hmm. And in fact, a lot of times when you see gun legislation that is not working properly, it's not necessarily because the legislation is flawed. It's because the implementation is flawed, often due to tremendous resistance from gun rights advocates. With red flag laws, though, even with the very uneven implementation, we are seeing an association between red flag laws and reduced suicides. And I believe that if we continue to expand these laws and to improve their implementation, you will see reduced homicides as well.
Let's touch a little bit more on mental health here as it relates to red flag laws, or generally speaking. What do our panelists think about the relationship between violence, gun violence, of course, in particular, and people who are mentally ill? We hear that talked about a lot. Richard.
Yeah, well, none of us is a mental health expert, but certainly my understanding from the community of mental health experts is that we ought not conflate gun violence and quote-unquote mental illness. The vast majority of the mentally ill, just as the vast majority of those who are not labeled mentally ill, will not commit gun violence. And of those who do commit gun violence in the form of mass shootings, the evidence is not that the great majority are mentally ill or experience severe mental health problems. Some do, most don't. So the idea that we would use the mental health system as somehow a screening device for selecting out those most at risk for committing the next mass shooting strikes me as empirically unsound and undesirable in all kinds of ways from a policy perspective.
Can I?
Yes, go ahead, Philip.
I think it's important to understand that Rick is right in terms of interpersonal violence, but for suicide, actually, there's a very high prevalence of mental illness. And the way the red flag laws were used, for example, in Connecticut, which had the first one, was primarily to prevent suicide. So that came as a surprise. It wasn't instituted with that in mind, but that's how it's been used.
I want to wrap up. We've had a lengthy discussion. We have many more areas, could get to many more audience questions. Our time is running out for the evening. I wanted to talk about bring the data, the research that you bring to the table as our panelists to what do you feel can be done now, given our political landscape within the next few years? What are the first steps you see actually being effective and possible in our political environment? Richard, you go first.
Thomas Abt, I hope will chime in. I assume he will, but a number of the policies and programs that Thomas described are, in fact, effective, can be initiated by local communities, and especially when compared with the costs of gun violence, can be done certainly not on the cheap, but efficiently. So we have tools at our disposal to reduce gun violence even further than it's already been come down over time. And those tools, use of those tools, does not require passing new laws anywhere.
I estimate that for less than $100 million, we could implement life-saving urban violence strategies in the 40 most violent cities across the nation, and we would reduce homicide by 10% each year in those cities. Ultimately, over 8 years, reducing homicide by more than 50%. Ultimately, saving more than 12,000 lives. And so, with urban violence, there are things we can do now that can really make a difference. I also believe that we often frame this debate only on the legislation side, because the urban violence issues are really on the program side. But when we talk about the legislation, we often focus on the impasse at the federal level, and that's a damaging issue. But there is lots of progress, state by state, law by law, bit by bit, in many states on these issues. There is also some backward progress in other states as well. But I think it's important to note that overall we are seeing advances in legislation at the state level.
Let's take it down to finish up to the individual level, because I look out in our audience and I see a dozen or more members of Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America here. These are people individually engaged. What can the individual do? And here's a specific question put out. What advice would you give to a community that is just beginning to consider the group violence intervention approach? Talk about that, or your other thoughts about what the individual can do instead of turning to lawmakers in Washington.
Well, I don't think there's a way around government in this area. We need government, and we need government to act appropriately and accountably in this area. And so I actually think that the most important thing to do is to hold your government accountable through participation, through voting, and through other things. And that's not just about legislation. That's also about appropriation, about dollars. And so with the group violence intervention that you asked, people should be asking if you live in a city that has a serious urban homicide problem, ask why they aren't doing this. Ask why the dollars don't go there. And once they start it, say, are you following up and implementing it the right way with fidelity? That kind of involvement, as we've seen in Oakland, where community members not only demanded the group violence intervention, but then sort of walked alongside the program and made sure that it was implemented effectively. In Oakland, it reduced homicides by 50% over 5 years.
Okay, to finish here, Richard Rosenfeld.
Yeah, here we are in Iowa, and you've got political candidates parading through your state. I certainly think as individuals you can press those candidates about what they propose to do to reduce gun violence.
Okay, let's leave it there. Thank you so much. Sorry if we didn't get to your question. Thanks to our panelists, Richard Rosenfeld, Janet Lauritsen, Philip Cook, and Thomas Abt. Thank you very much, and for your questions.